roll call. Ms. Hoeksma, will you call roll?
Thank you. Yes. Commissioner Callahan? Oh, I'm sorry. You're muted. Okay. Commissioner Galuska? Commissioner Lynn?
Here.
Commissioner Malik?
Here.
Vice Chair Wamashonje? Huh. Are you guys unable to unmute? Weird. Okay. Chair Sager?
Here.
Thank you.
All right. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. Is there any changes anybody wishes to make? Okay, agenda is approved. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes from February 3rd meeting. Does anybody have any changes they'd like to make to the minutes? Seeing none. Next item on the agenda is general public comment. Is there anybody signed up tonight for general public comment?
I have no one signed up. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Then the next item is the study item, which is the Transportation Master Plan update. And I'm assuming that we have a presentation.
We do indeed.
Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Daly Peng.
Good evening, commissioners. Thank you for having us join your meeting. I'm going to be co-presenting tonight with Kendra Dudinsky, our city's traffic engineer, and Kendra's starting up the share screening right now. And while she's doing that, I will introduce myself. My name's Nora Daly Peng. I am the senior transportation planner with the city. And this is the third of a series of briefings to the Planning Commission about the Transportation Master Plan update, which we refer to as the TMP. And the last time staff met with the Planning Commission was last November, right before Thanksgiving. Tonight, Kendra Dudinsky and myself will provide an overview of auto level of service options that define the adequacy of general purpose vehicles, capacity and flow on our city's arterials as part of the TMP update.
Nora, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Do you think you could share for me? Because my notes are going to conflict.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt you.
It's no problem. Let me just swap over here. Let me just cue this up so I'm not pecking around my desktop for it. All right.
I'm sorry for the last minute swap there. My notes are in a separate format, so.
It's no problem. Okay. Now let me share my screen. Here we go. Okay, we're back on track. And confirming everyone can see my PowerPoint presentation. Great. Okay, so what is the Transportation Master Plan, which I refer to as the TMP for short? The TMP is a long-range blueprint of multimodal travel throughout the city. And the last time the TMP was updated was 2011. So it is a little more than 10 years old. And the TMP will provide a framework to guide investments in existing and new transportation infrastructure and programs over the next 20 years. In the fall of 2020, the city launched a multi-year process to update the TMP. with the goal of adoption by the end of 2022. City staff has and will continue briefing the commission as well as council throughout the process and seek your feedback on the development of the TMP. You will be seeing quite a bit of me over March and April as we're gearing up for our third outreach series. To date, the project team has assessed existing conditions, conducted 2 rounds of outreach, developed the TMP's vision, goals, and project evaluation framework. The team is now working on what we call multimodal level of service policies, draft modal plans for walking, biking, taking transit, using shared use mobility and driving through our city. We're also working on a process for prioritizing projects, and we're preparing for that third wave of outreach, which we expect to launch in May. The project team is taking a multimodal approach to evaluating our city's transportation system. What do I mean by that? A multimodal approach relies on what we call a layered network that outlines on the network each mode, walking, biking, driving, taking transit, and where that should be accommodated. We are developing modal policies, which define how we accommodate each of those modes. So a little bit, diving in a little bit deeper on that. What are we considering for each one of those modes? Well, for the pedestrian mode, we are really lifting off and relying on the good work that was done in 2018 with the existing sidewalk prioritization plan, as well as looking at land use context and street classifications. For bikes, we are using the state of the practice, which considers providing comfortable, low-stressed environment tailored for serving people of all ages and abilities. For transit, we are thinking about how we can coordinate, not just thinking, but we are doing the coordination with our transit agencies to advocate for service for our community's needs, as well as stop amenities that make riding convenient and comfortable. You'll hear me use this word shared use mobility, and I will be coming back to the commission in April to talk more about that mode, but a little bit of a teaser. Most of you might be aware of the work that we did with the Evans School, because I did touch on that during my November presentation to the Planning Commission. We were very fortunate to hire the UW Evans School to look at a concept called mobility hubs. And essentially, those are places that can be launch pads for transportation options to complete short trips around the city. Transportation options like e-bikes, e-scooters, car-to-go, etc. And finally, auto and freight. This is really the focus of tonight's discussion. The city's existing policy considers mainly delay at arterial intersections. And we're going to be discussing whether our current policies meet our needs or should they be adjusted to be more context sensitive. And so with that, I am going to pass over this presentation to Kendra Dudinsky.
There we go. Kendra Dudinsky, City Traffic Engineer, and I haven't had the pleasure of meeting all of you yet, so good to be here and meet you all, at least virtually. So I'm going to really dive into a lot of technical details tonight. So If I accidentally use an acronym without defining it or explaining it, please do catch me on that and let me know. And if there's anything that really needs clarification along the way, please also feel free to let me know, because this is some pretty technical and in-depth information we'll be going through. And we'll pause at kind of a midway point for some potential questions and clarifications as well. But with no further ado, we will jump in now to this topic. So what is level of service? So Shoreline currently measures performance of intersections using a standard methodology known as traffic level of service. This is used by jurisdictions all over the country, and level of service represents the average delay per vehicle during the peak hour at a controlled intersection. Individual LOS grades, so LOS being level of service, grades are assigned on a letter scale A through F, with LOS A representing free flow conditions with no delay, and LOS F representing highly congested conditions with long delays. And you can see the delays in the table associated with those letter grades. It should be noted that LOS grades are not analogous to school grades necessarily, where A is good and F is bad. In an urban environment or a denser environment, free flow traffic operations aren't expected, nor are they necessarily a good thing, as they can represent kind of an overinvestment in vehicular modes, typically at the expense of pedestrians and bicyclists. Next slide. So the city's current level of service policy requires level of service D at signalized intersections on arterials and at most unsignalized intersecting arterials, with the exception of state routes, which have a level of service standard of E. We talked about the intersection level of service on the last slide, but here we're also introducing our supplemental volume to capacity standard, which simply put takes the measured or anticipated volume of the roadway and divides it by the theoretical capacity. We'll get into a little bit more detail on that later, so just hold that in your thoughts for now. The capacity is typically established by regional models, just to note. Can you go back to the last slide? Sorry, Nora. Let's see here. So another concept that I did want to kind of introduce before we jump into kind of the host of options that we're considering is the concept of growth projects and transportation impact fees. We're not going to talk a lot about that today, but I wanted to quickly note that level of service standards kind of directly correlate to transportation impact fees paid by development, or in some cases by the city, where we exempt development from paying them. So any location that is not meeting our level of service standard as we kind of evaluate it today must be mitigated or exempted from the standard. So to mitigate, growth projects are planned, and the estimated cost of those projects is the basis for impact fees. So basically, the more projects there are, the higher the TIF, the impact fee, becomes. And this is a fundamental principle to keep in mind as we talk through the various options and how it relates to how we grow as a city. Okay, next slide. All right, so looking here at a table of options that we are in partnership with our consultant team, who's really leading this, have considered for vehicle level of service. We're going to step through each of these in more detail. So this table is just a preview of what's to come. But at a high level, option one's showing everything stays the same. It's the do nothing option, essentially, with level of service D applied to intersections on arterials. Option 2A would allow for a level service E adjacent to commercial or kind of higher density zoning, but retains level service D for everything else. Option 2B allows an LOS E in candidate countywide center areas, which are our 148th station area, our 185th station area, Shoreline Place, and Town Center, and that would similarly require LOSD everywhere else in all the residential areas and other kind of miscellaneous pockets throughout the city. The last option, option 3, which is a bit complex, so I'm happy to pause once we get there, proposes an average methodology, LOSE, for intersections along particular corridors in our denser areas, and D for everywhere else. So that is averaging level of service across multiple intersections. So a little bit different than the previous 3 we're describing, which apply to individual intersections. Okay, So next slide. So jumping in, we're going to go through piece by piece through the 4 options, pros and cons, and then look at them together. This is really just evaluating a basic overview of our first option from a pro-con perspective, which is our status quo, our level service D citywide at arterial intersections. And so want to note too, and just keep this in mind also, that state routes are exempted from that to level service E already. The benefits of this option of kind of staying the same are really its simplicity. It also upholds the least vehicle delay. So this would make sure that, you know, driving remains at least relatively convenient citywide. On the flip side, though, upholding this lower vehicle delay really does come at a cost, mainly to walkers and bikers, as wider roadways and intersections make for, you know, more exposed crossings and a less friendly walking and biking community, as well as just less available right of way to work with, right? Another big concern with this option, and perhaps, you know, just again relating back to the impact fee, is this option would be the highest cost, both to the city and developers, for mitigation projects that are required to make sure the intersections function at this level of service B. So the more projects required for this more conservative LOS policy, the higher the TIF ends up being. So those are the main benefits and trade-offs of staying the same. Next slide. Option 2A. So this is a slightly different approach here that we're looking at now. And this map is illustrating how it would differ from the current approach. And so this map, you're seeing red and green areas intersecting, and then intersections along basically each of the red colored segments adjacent to higher zoning designations would be allowed to function at LOSE. While green, anything kind of outside of those red areas, would still be required to function at LOSD. So this is kind of applying a little bit more context sensitivity to where we hope that users expect to see a little bit more delay and to slow down a little bit for urban context, right? So more people out walking and biking, probably more street activity and the like. And so really tying in the zoning designations to the level of service standard. Next slide. Okay, so looking at the pros and cons of this more context sensitive approach, we see it serves to better balance the modal priorities. So what I mean by that is we're not required under this option as much to expand roadways in areas where we're hoping to see more people on foot or bikes or scooters, that sort of thing. This option does still evaluate individual intersections, so it maintains simplicity in the same sense our current standard does. And notably, as I mentioned before, lower cost slightly than the status quo. That said, with this option, you saw there's variation throughout the city. That can bring some edge issues that I'll mention on another couple options too. And what I mean by that is if we allow for a level service E on one intersection that's kind of adjacent to a residential area, you could expect that delay kind of trickling into that residential area too, right? So that's something that we need to be kind of cognizant of as we evaluate these options. Additionally, with this option, there are, as you saw, little pockets of higher land use, right? So let's take Richmond Beach, down by bowling alley, et cetera, that aren't necessarily as well supported with transportation options, right? They're not right next to light rail stations and maybe just one or two transit lines, not a complete sidewalk network. And so it might feel more appropriate actually to maintain a LOSD in those areas that are kind of on the fringe and not in our core area that has the more robust transportation options, as we would probably expect them to remain at least somewhat vehicle dependent. Okay, next slide. So that's where we kind of put our heads together, and this is where option 2B comes in. And this map shows where we're proposing LOSE be allowed, excuse me, in candidate countywide centers. And so this was, we recently received these designations from King County for our areas where we're really trying to center the growth, right? 148th, 185th, Town Center, Shoreline Place. These are the areas where we're anticipating the most growth, that will have the most well-connected and robust transportation options, providing opportunities really for people to get around in other ways. And it's also where we're expecting to see just more robust land use and supportive services, right? Like grocery stores or things that people can maybe walk or bike to, and where you would frankly expect to see a little bit more friction and traffic delay. All right, next slide. So this option has a lot of the same benefits as option 2A in terms of being slightly lower cost than status quo. It better balances mobile priorities with context sensitivity, and I would argue even kind of more context sensitivity than 2A in that we're really focusing in on the center area where we're expecting the most growth. But it also better addresses some of the downsides. There's fewer edge issues, right? So you would expect fewer kind of trickling out from the growth centers than in comparison to the multiple locations that occur in the zoning designation option. And we know the other thing, we know that our zoning can change. It's not something that happens frequently, but it could change over time in small areas, right? Small pockets or parcels, which can pose a challenge for kind of making the level service standard consistent with zoning specifically. These centers are less likely to kind of be a moving target. And so anchoring our level of service to that makes sense from a consistency perspective as well. All right, next slide. Getting to our last intersection option that we've evaluated. So this is option 3. And this really allows the greatest flexibility. And by that, I really mean it allows the highest amount of vehicle delay. It groups some key corridors in our denser areas together, setting a standard of an E average. So that's what I was speaking about earlier. What this means is that 1 or 2 intersections along one of these grouped corridors might actually fail, have a very high level of delay. But if the kind of weighted average of all of them taken together still produces a level service E, then we consider it okay and don't need to mitigate at that point. So by using an average of multiple intersections, you basically allow for a higher level delay, right? So all of the, and I should note that all of the intersections outside of the groupings would be expected to operate at LOSD or better. So definitely a bit more complexity added with this option. As you can see, this practice is in place in other cities. Kent is one regional example where this averaging method is used. All right, next slide. So again, most flexibility in terms of allowing highest levels of delay. And so, on what that means is it requires the least amount of cost associated with making vehicle capacity improvements, which means that it could free up capital potentially to focus in on more pedestrian and bike centered improvements as we move through our modal multimodal level of service standard. It also, in a way, does work to match the driver experience that, as you take a trip, you're traveling through multiple intersections. So maybe, some added delay at 1 or 2 intersections is acceptable along your trip, so long as the trip as a whole functions at a certain level. But on the downside, this option is significantly more complex for developers to analyze and for the city to review and oversee. And obviously, too, the downside is it allows for higher auto delays, which, certainly I think we've heard from our community to some degree that is a concern. This particular option 2 certainly has the edge issues as described earlier, and to some degree a perception potentially of arbitrariness. How are we choosing to group those intersections together could be challenging. So we need to be very careful that we got the corridor groupings right. All right, next slide. That was a lot of information, a lot of options, a lot to weigh in terms of trade-off benefits. So this table makes an attempt to summarize those pros and cons all together. So when we consider all of those various benefits and trade-offs, what staff is seeing with our consultant is that option 2B, which is the refined district approach for using centers as the basis for kind of a higher level delay in some areas. It really rises to the top in terms of balancing the various competing needs citywide. Option 1, we can clearly see promotes vehicle capacity, but again, that comes at a high cost to growth and development, and also to walkability and bikeability. So I just want you to keep that thread in mind as we talk through these. So option 2A strikes a better balance, as we talked about, in terms of context sensitivity, but there are a few little kind of inconsistencies or concerns. And so 2B really tightens up that allowance of higher delay to the specific districts where we're expecting growth, and that will have those robust transportation services. And then 3, of course, while it perhaps kind of better promotes or kind of frees up some capital for walkability and bikeability in theory, in terms of considering our overall capital costs of what we expect these growth projects to look like, it could be perceived as a poor fit for some areas of the city that kind of lack robust transportation options. As you know, people kind of out on the outskirts that are not in those centers specifically, will likely still rely on some vehicle modes. So we thought in reviewing these full options that 2B seemed to fit the bill the best. All right. I can pause here if there's any questions so far, but there's some more slides to go through still in terms of the modeling, analysis and findings, as well as the VC. So if there's any kind of clarifying questions you had about the intersection approaches, I can answer any clarifying questions now. Otherwise, the discussion component will be at the very end. And I'm not seeing any hands up. Oh, there's one. Go right ahead.
Yeah, when you're talking about the kind of localized approaches, so you're talking about the impact on intersections in those areas, or are we talking about trips generated from those areas?
Is your question what I'm talking about, the edge issues, or are you asking, I guess I'm not entirely following the question. I'm sorry.
So a hypothetical project, if I was, let's say there's a proposed project outside of one of the countywide centers, but it has traffic impact within the center. Are we looking at the impact to intersections in those, or projects within those centers?
Yeah, both. So the basis of impact fees is that, we put together this projected modeling, right? And we see a number of intersections that we're expecting to fail and need improvement. And this is true for other modes as well, and we'll get there eventually. But that forms basically a list of needs that we need to fund over the years. And so we come up as transportation planners and engineers with a list of projects and some estimates for those projects. And then it's basically divvied out as a growth share as a per trip fee. And so a developer in any part of the city pays a per trip fee to mitigate failures within the centers, outside of the centers, wherever they may occur. So that's sort of the macro level, the systemic impact that a particular project might have on the system, on the transportation system citywide. At a more micro level, at a localized level, we also review a specific project impact on specific intersections surrounding the project. And it can go quite a bit broader depending on how big the project is. And so we would review against whatever level of service standard we set, the project's impact to particular intersections directly around the area. So we're looking both, we're accounting, and this is how we're currently doing it and how we will probably continue doing it. We're looking both at systemic impacts and at localized impacts, if that makes sense. I don't know if I answered your question at all, but I tried.
Well, so for example, under 2B, if there's a proposed project in the Richmond Beach area and it had a traffic impact at the intersection of 104 and 99, would under 2B, would we be looking at the intersection at level E because the intersection's within the countywide center, or would it have to be a project that's proposed in the countywide center?
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Yeah, all projects would have to meet the countywide center, intent. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think probably an important thing to keep in mind is that what that does in a way is it does also incentivize growth in the countywide center as opposed to outside of the countywide center, right? Because if you're reviewing your project's impacts in an area, being able to go up to an E provides a little more flexibility for you as a project, which it does do the work of somewhat incentivizing growth within the centers. Good question. Thank you for clarifying that. I'm sorry it took me a while to pick it up. All right. Let's jump into modeling. And I should note that this is still somewhat draft, but it does provide a good basis for comparison between the various options. So bear that in mind, but you'll certainly see final versions here eventually. So here we're looking at the 2019 existing PM peak level of service. So this will give you some context for what things feel like in terms of the level of service grades. I do want to note that we're using 2019 as a baseline because of how significantly COVID impacted traffic volumes. So we, as we were kind of working on this stuff, we were right in the midst of COVID when traffic volumes were at an all-time low. So we used 2019 and kind of escalate or, inflated them from there to get to kind of our baseline where we are now. So as you can see, there's a few intersections experiencing LOSD on this map. You're seeing mainly along Aurora and Meridian, which I'm sure a lot of you would expect in your daily travels. You might have experienced this. A few other locations certainly on there as well. But you'll see, some spots where we have even some failures, like near the college. This is the one related to the college's growth, and it's the one that Shoreline Community College is funding a mitigation project for. So in the future, you'll see that move to an acceptable level of service as they will be mitigating that. And noting here too that we are looking just at kind of constrained or example intersections geographically. We're not looking at every intersection in the city. We chose the ones that we expect either to experience most growth, to cover a geographic area, or that are the most sort of constrained today. So, all right, Nora can move along. And now this is looking into the future at 2044, and our consultant to kind of create this level of service analysis used the projected growth that we expect to see. So, housing and population growth in our city distributed to the areas we expect to see it in. This was all kind of a tag team effort between, us and our consultant and planning and community development, distributing those people and jobs throughout the city to determine where trips will occur. And then what they do is they use a regional transportation model from PSRC, along with our baseline volumes that we've put together for 2019 to determine what that will look like into the future on our existing network. So as you can see, a few more intersections bumping into an LOS E or F, which would fail by our current standards without mitigation. All right, next slide. And so what this boils down to for the various options that we discussed previously, really focus on the right column is the most important one probably. It's split out by signals and stop controlled intersections, but the right one is really just showing the total need. So basically what this is showing here is the summary of how many intersections would fail according to that standard. So you can see 6 fail with our status quo, 5 under the 2 district approaches, and 3 with the last corridor averaging approach, which is mainly related, if you recall, things outside of the grouped corridors still have to meet that D standard, and if you did not. So you can see it's really kind of orders of magnitude difference, but overall, we're still going to have a few intersections that need mitigation regardless of which option we were to choose. I also do want to note that, you know, like I said, we're not analyzing every single intersection. If a large project were to come in outside of, you know, the areas that we've kind of anticipated them being in, we would be analyzing that and holding them to whatever standard we choose here. The district approach would be more conservative, I would say, for anything that pops up in a place that we didn't necessarily expect, if that makes sense. All right. Okay, so with that summary of sort of our modeling results and impacts based on the various options, I'm now going to jump topics to our supplemental. This is a level of service standard supplementing the intersection level of service standard called VC ratio, volume to capacity ratio, okay? And so as shown here, the calculation, and so this is basically an add-on to what we have right now, and this is an existing thing we have in place. So we'll be discussing options for this as well, the supplemental. So as you can see here, the calculations relatively, oh, I'm sorry, Vice Chair, you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I had a real quick question. Did you, when you changed the prioritization and you degraded the LOS from D to E, did you also do a study to see what benefits or what lead time the pedestrian crossing would be at those intersections if you did that?
That's an incredibly intuitive observation that you've just brought up, or question. You know, there are not any great sort of high-level modeling tools to do that work, I would say, in the engineering industry. You've hit on something that is near and dear to my heart, and that I think is incredibly important here, because you're probably making the jump to the correlation that if you widen intersections and increase signal cycle lengths, people are waiting on those corners longer. It takes you longer on foot to walk places, right? So there is a trade-off to pedestrian travel time even, and bicyclist travel time, not just experience or safety, but actually how long it takes them to get around when you start widening intersections. That is a very, very good observation or correlation if that's the one you were jumping to. But I would say, no, it's not. I think that it might make sense, though, for us to include kind of a high-level table of what that could look like. We wouldn't maybe systematically, because there's no tool for doing this, look at all of the intersections and look at the maybe time difference on a per person basis. But what we could do is provide a relative comparison of, if you add a lane, here's what that does to the pedestrian travel time, right? There are ways to at least maybe qualitatively describe that, because you're right, that is absolutely a trade-off of improving vehicle capacity is always at the expense of pedestrians. Yep.
Then the other question is similarly theoretical, but it has to do with seeing that this is a 20-year plan, then also understanding that climate change is really very important. So the question has to do with idle times at those intersections and the emissions that are anticipated as a result. So question is, did we take that into consideration, since we're looking at, I know 20 years from now we'll have maybe more electrical vehicles, so the question becomes moot definitely. But right now, did we think of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can let Nora talk a little bit about our environmental kind of process that we're going to bring kind of all of this discussion through eventually. There's a lot of crystal balling there for sure. I mean, there isn't any one industry standard for saying, for basically equating a level service standard to, you know, a 20-year projection of vehicle emissions per se. You're right that more idle time certainly increases emissions. However, I would say that increasing vehicle capacity to improve those emissions, ultimately what that tends to do, or at least what we've seen that happen over the last 20 to 30 years, is it invites more people to drive. If you make it more appealing to drive, more people will drive and clog up those intersections again, right? So you end up basically at a net zero there in terms of improving your environmental, emission status, at least in my experience. And I think regionally that tends to be the case. But there is a tool that we will be applying to our TMP process as a whole when we look to prioritize projects, certainly. And I don't know if you want to add to that, Nora, now or later, but.
Sure, I'll just, sorry, there might be a little echo with my voice or reverb, but we are planning to come back to the commission in March to talk about the prioritization and performance process for these projects. So we are indeed looking at, measuring what we want. So I came to you in November and kind of walked through our vision and goals. And now it's time really to kind of shore that up in the process in terms of prioritizing the projects that are going to get to like our better future. So I won't go into a lot of detail tonight, but I also do want to say that we're fortunate as a city that in tandem with a TMP update, we are also doing a climate action plan update and really taking a hard look at drastically reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And I think everyone knows that transportation has the biggest foot when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. It's about 56% of our overall city's greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation emissions. So we have, there's not going to be like one silver bullet that's going to bring that into check. We're going to have to use all of the strategies. And so I will be definitely coming back and looking forward to that conversation with the commission.
Thank you very much. Very educating. Thank you. Then last question, sorry for hogging the mic. The last question is, I noticed the advantage of actually reducing, degrading those intersections time. In terms of development, there's an advantage, but I don't think we touched on freight and the possibility that cost for goods and services might actually go up because normally that cost gets transferred to the consumer. So when you delay through a corridor, that cost gets. I don't think I heard it captured, so I think it does. It exists. So I don't know if you guys considered that also.
Yeah, the economics of delay absolutely is something that we've talked about in the past. I think there are a number of good publications that try to quantify that, and it is real. Certainly, I would say in a city our size, 3 miles roughly long, the added delay that we're talking about between these various options is not particularly significant, I don't think, from an economic perspective. Adding a minute or two to a trip, an Amazon trip, for example, is probably not going to be noticeable enough, I wouldn't think, to pass on that cost. It is a real consideration, though, certainly. And I think, we are exploring freight and goods and services to some degree, but I would say it's been, as a whole, a slightly lesser consideration in comparison to kind of the high priorities we've heard from our residents and businesses. And so the main themes that we continue to hear in Shoreline is about sidewalks and walkability and being able to cross the street safely. And, and considering those things, I think we're trying to juggle the various competing priorities. And so we've been certainly focused a little bit more, I would say, on the walkability side of the equation, just because that's what the overwhelming feedback we've received is. But certainly we're trying to balance that as well as we can with vehicle mobility, which is why really the staff preferred option is option 2B as opposed to something that's more aggressive, right? We know that there's still going to be some automobile dependence, as well as a need to deliver things, as well as a need for buses to drive around, right? So we're trying to make sure that we're accommodating both of those competing needs, the need for people to be able to kind of actively live in and around the street and cross the street and be in these centers where it's going to be dense and more thriving and more of a pedestrian walkable community, and then balancing that really with our more suburban residential communities and the need for people to get around in cars. So yeah, it is a balance, certainly. I don't know that we're working to quantify that freight component per se, but it is certainly a consideration. Yeah. All right. I will.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'll pick up, I think, from where I left off. So sorry if I do. But yeah, so switching gears to thinking about segments now, rather than intersection-based level of service. So we're looking at the supplemental measure that's more of a high-level tool for screening and for kind of identifying potential risk issues. And this really comes to play, I would say, more so on larger scale developments where we're just trying to see, does that fit here? And so the volume, what we're looking at is the peak hour traffic volume. That's 1 hour of the day in the peak hour direction over the capacity, the theoretical capacity of the roadway, which is established typically by regional models with some maybe minor modifications from the jurisdiction. And so our current standard is a VC of 0.9 or lower on principal and minor arterials. And there are a couple of exemptions that we have on file right now in our code, but generally speaking, that applies to all principal and minors, which are the red and the yellow. All right, next slide. So looking at the options that we kind of came up with for this standard, the supplemental standard, option 1 keeps things the same. So similar to the last iteration of options that we're talking through, we have a no change option to evaluate, applying 0.9 or lower to principal and minor arterials. Option 2 removes the standard altogether, and option 3 syncs it up with our preferred intersection method, which is the level of service allowable, increased delay in those centers. And so what we would propose here to sync up would be a VC ratio of 1.1 or lower in the candidate countywide centers and retaining 0.9 for everything else. So status quo for everything else. All right, next slide. All right, so status quo. So the pros, really the pros of maintaining any supplemental measures that it would provide another check against the intersection level service standard. So it provides a non-intersection based metric for us to look at and evaluate projects against. On the con side, it is a rather simplistic tool, and it is not a standard tool. So this is not a measure that you'll find in an engineering manual. And so that makes it somewhat complex for development review and to oversee as a whole, just because it is kind of a niche or unique standard. And then I think probably importantly, maybe most importantly here, to keep in mind again in balancing the conflicting needs in our city, is that the 0.9 standard, as we grow as a city, particularly in the centers, could end up being cost prohibitive to growth in general, because the prescriptive solution is adding capacity. And what that most of the time means is that you need to add a lane. Adding lanes is very expensive and takes up a lot of right of way, and it adds to roadways where we don't necessarily want roadways widened, right, through our main kind of core areas where we're expecting growth and more thriving walkability. And so the more conservative standard of 0.9 in some of our areas just might not make sense in the context of some of our centers. All right, next slide. So option 2, we look at just taking it off the table altogether. Like I said, it's not a typical kind of highway capacity manual standard that's used by reviewers everywhere. And so this would simplify things from a development kind of analysis and review perspective. It also gets us away from the forced solution of widening and avoids building infrastructure in places that may be somewhat inappropriate. But the cons are, obviously on the flip side of the slide we just looked at, that it removes a supplemental measure that does serve as a sort of check and balance. Make sure that the intersections are capturing everything. We're not, looking at just one metric might allow some things to fall through the cracks. And so this does provide a sort of backup, a gut check, if you will. So removing it removes that gut check. So option 3. All right, so this is the refined one that syncs up with the district approach by centers option again. So allowing for 1.1 within the centers. And so again, the pros are that it provides a gut check, a non-intersection based metric for us to look at in conjunction with larger projects. This option though is more context sensitive, right? So it avoids necessarily widening in our centers, in those areas next to light rail stations where, if things get congested, people might be able to hop on light rail or use a scooter at one of the great mobility hubs that might pop up, right? So, and the other pro is that this is consistent, and that's really key. I think anytime we set a code or a standard, we want it to be consistent and defensible. And this one would be consistent with the intersection level service standard we would be looking at a preference for, which is that centers method. And then cons, again, the same issues here. It does prescribe one solution if we do end up with a failure, and it does add complexity to the development review process. Certainly not a fatal flaw by any means, but all right. And this is just kind of showing you the 2044, and again, this is draft, note the corner, but what we would project to see failing into the future with the current standard. And so you can see a number of orange and red segments on this map would technically not meet our 0.9 standard into 2044, and would thereby, under our current standard, need to be addressed through a growth project. And mainly, again, that means widening. There are some other methods on some of these corridors that might apply, but generally speaking, that's looking like adding lanes. All right, next slide. And wrapping that into a table, just like the other version did. So for the existing method, or the existing standard, we see 9 corridors, and some of those are quite long, that would fail the 0.9 standard potentially into 2044. Removing it, obviously, it's not really applicable. We wouldn't measure it. And then number 3, the one that's kind of consistent with our citywide centers, allowing a 1.1, we end up kind of cutting the number by more than half of mitigation projects. And so that becomes, again, a little bit more manageable, more context sensitive. All right. With that, I'm going to sum it up. For the technical side of the presentation. And so again, just kind of bringing you back to where staff and the consultant has landed, which is that the district approach seems to be the best balance of competing needs in the city. It's still maintaining a fairly good level of delay, especially on the outer edges of our city, that are more auto dependent, but it is providing a layer of context sensitivity that is absent today. So what this does is it puts those areas in the centers as a level of service E or 1.1 for segments, and then everywhere else maintains the same standard we have today. That's all I've got. I think, Nora, you had a couple of reminders just about next steps.
Thank you so much. I'll just wrap up next steps, and then I want to pass it over to the Planning Commission for discussion. But just giving you an idea of what we are doing and when we'll be returning to the Planning Commission. So over the winter, we have as a team been working on developing draft modal plans for pedestrian, bicycle, transit, shared use mobility, and freight and auto modes. And we will be returning to the Planning Commission on March 17th to share the TMP's process for prioritizing projects, and as well as performance measures, how we can track progress and show how we're achieving the goals of the TMP. We will debut the draft modal plans with you in early April, as well as share an overview of the activities and events we have planned for Outreach Series 3. And just again, I think I mentioned it up front, but we are planning to launch Outreach Series 3 in about mid-April. And just a quick overview, what we will be bringing to the public is sharing the results of what we learned so far. We had a really great turnout for Outreach Series 2, which was last summer. And we want to formally bring that back to the community and share what we learned. And then also we want to debut the draft modal plans with the public and ask for their feedback. And we also want feedback on the draft prioritization process. So with that, I am going to stop sharing, and we are available to help answer any questions. I'd like to pass it back over to the chair for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. That was a lot of technical information, very informative. Before we get into discussion, does anybody have any just clarifying questions they'd like to ask? Commissioner Malik. You are muted.
If we could, thank you, sorry. If we could go back to the slides at 2044, I think it was like the third to last slide, and it had the map on it where you were showing V over C as 1.1 versus 0.9 and how that would mitigate some of the, since we one more. There you go. Just curious about that little red line over there between 8th and 3rd off of, that's it, right there. Why that side of the street and not the other side of the street? Is it commercial? I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah.
And same thing over here on Aurora and then again on 15th. Yeah, thank you, sorry.
You'll notice something very, very intuitive once I describe it to you. It's because it's measuring the peak direction, which is northbound during the PM, right? Or in the case of Richmond Beach Road, westbound during the PM. So we are, whenever we look and talk about level of service standards, we're only measuring kind of the worst case scenario during the day. So we're looking at the highest hour during a 24-hour period, and that's almost always, not always, but most of the time, the PM peak. So it's mostly going to correlate, any mitigation related to failure is most of the time going to correlate to that PM peak direction. Primarily, you end up impacting both, especially with intersection mitigation, but it's looking at that PM peak direction. So Richmond Beach Road, most people are headed home in the evening, so you're going to see it in the westbound direction.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Gosh, kind of. I think it's just what you're saying is it's the way you're measuring it. And you're
doing it's what the VC measures and what the intersection level service measures. So when we look at each direction separately and we measure the VC for each of the directions. So what we do is we plug in the hourly traffic count for, let's say, 5 to 6 p.m. on Richmond Beach Road, westbound. We divide it by the theoretical capacity of that direction, and that gives you your VC. In the eastbound direction, volumes are lower, so you're ending up with a lower VC, right? Because in the eastbound direction, there aren't as many cars traveling eastbound headed out of the community.
So this isn't something where you'd be doing a blend of 8 a.m. peak traffic, 5 p.m. peak traffic, or anything like that. You're doing it at PMP.
You do the worst case scenario. Yeah.
So this is a function of the metric of how you're taking the measurements of. Got it. So it's just it's a artifact of sorts, but that's so
it is.
Yeah.
And there communities do this in different ways, particularly this sort of supplemental measure. Some communities like Bellevue uses a 2-hour average instead of a 1, so that kind of dissipates the impact a little bit. You can certainly look at the entire function of the roadway in both directions as opposed to directional. This is a more conservative approach, I would say, but it is kind of aligned or consistent with what we've done in the past.
Thanks. My other question, and I'll is what's the alternate to V over C? Is it ADT? What's the other metric?
Yeah, I would say that that's true. Yes, an ADT threshold would be another common metric as a supplemental standard. Snohomish County, for example, uses an ADT threshold in their level of service standard. And it's kind of the same. It just eliminates that theoretical capacity side of the equation.
I can tell you there was a lot of friction when that came up around Richmond Beach for very good reason. Just our little neighborhood, in particular with Point Wells, looking at that small arterial leading up to a mega,
Yes.
project that would be literally 10% of the total population of shoreline right there in that little spit of land. And then how do you get them in and out? So, and then using ADT versus V over C, that was quite contentious. So it was interesting. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and you might remember that we do have an ADT threshold on Richmond Beach still in the sub-area plan. So we do still use ADT as a threshold as well. And I think, there's still some flexibility to consider ADT as a measure. But I think where we've gone so far is that VC is quite similar in nature in terms of how you measure and apply it, and it would be consistent with past practices and kind of everything we've built to date. So that's why we're going to continue that practice in this review of options. Yeah.
Sure.
All right.
Commissioner Galuska.
WashDOT has adopted a threshold standard of 0.9 VC for their rights of way. If in shoreline do they enforce that threshold on the WashDOT jurisdictions in the city, or because of the size, are we too big for them to do that?
Yeah, it's a bit of murky territory, I would say, but if I can be, if I can give you a clear answer, it would be no, they don't enforce it on our state highways, I wouldn't say. In cities of a certain size, and we're a city over a population that, to the point where we maintain kind of our own city standards for the state highways, as well as all of the stuff on the state highway, with a few exceptions. So generally speaking, cities do have a fair amount of control over kind of how they want their state highways through their cities to operate. We do still, of course, work under the constraints of WashDOT and work with them and coordinate and partner to the degree necessary. But yeah, it's I would not be concerned particularly about that standard. The other thing is the way that WashDOT applies it is, I think, slightly different than what we're talking about here. The VC standard is actually an engineering standard as it applies to intersection approaches. And it has a whole series of calculations with the highway capacity manual associated with it. I suspect that is the way that the state applies it, and I think we would still meet the standard in this case, regardless. So, good question.
Thank you. Anybody else clarifying questions? All right, we can open this up for discussion. People have any comments? Anything else? Commissioner Callahan.
I just wanted to ask about the problem of cut-through traffic. So instead of someone going from point A to point B using the arterial streets that you would expect. They, zigzag through the neighborhood. And as traffic increases, that's likely to become more of a problem. And then if, there are more delays at traffic lights, that might become more of an issue in certain areas. Or even if someone's using a driving app, it might reroute them through the neighborhood if areas get too congested. Some communities are having to deal with that. So I was just wondering, like, if with all the data that you have, I mean, it's the analysis that you've done is really impressive, but I was just curious to know if it's taking into account how people might try to avoid those traffic jams, and how you might monitor this and make sure that the residential streets are going to be safe.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's an important one, and it's one we get a lot in terms of community concerns. So glad that you brought it up. So it's multifaceted. So bear with me here, both from the modeling perspective and just principle. So from the modeling perspective, these high-level travel demand models do not do a good job of trying to gauge impacts to local streets, or kind of in the same way that maybe a water model would predict kind of the least friction, if you will. The other thing is people do weird things, and they sometimes cut through even though there isn't an added travel time benefit, right? So we don't function quite the same way water does. So it's a little harder to predict that at a model level. And the other side of that is if we are to maybe, as practitioners say, well, we think about 10% of the traffic's going to be onto these side streets. That also, what that does is it waters down the impact on the intersection when we're trying to anticipate what that would actually function like if all the trips were to go through, right? So we want to be able to see what it would be like if they all stayed on the arterial network, so that we can mitigate to ensure it meets our standard, right? If we peel trips off onto the local street network, what that does is it says, oh, there's less impacts on this arterial intersection. We don't need to mitigate it. So from a modeling perspective, the better option for what we're doing right now for this application is to keep them on the arterial, so that we can make sure our arterials are functioning from a mobility perspective the way that we want them to, or the way that we kind of are trying to slate them to. So that's the modeling perspective. They don't do a great job of capturing cut-through traffic. So setting that aside for a second, then how do we make sure the volumes on streets are appropriate? I would say this is complex. So from a local street perspective, I would say to some degree the volumes on those local streets can be somewhat self-limiting, and that's kind of the intent, right? So on local streets, we have design standards now that will hopefully be self-limiting in terms of volumes. It will hopefully add enough friction, narrow lanes, narrower streets, on-street parking, things that make it less comfortable for people to zip through. And I think there's certainly lots of opportunities for especially in the denser areas, for developers to partner with us on traffic calming devices and the like. We don't have anything, and nor does any city really have anything codified that says, if there's this much volume, you must do this. Nothing to that of that nature exists for traffic calming. There's nothing to say that 2,000 cars a day on a local street is bad or unsafe. There's nothing that says that. No engineering standard will say that. And they're public streets. So that's kind of what we grapple with, is like, they're public streets. Do they, is the impact to that local street resident any worse than it would be to an arterial street resident with 2,000 more vehicles on their street, right? So we have to consider that and try to treat them equitably. And from a safety perspective, there is not clear data that shows, if you increase the traffic on a local street by 10 or 15%, that inherently makes it less safe. And so we have to use kind of the tools that we have to improve things by design. So making those streets narrower, less inviting, maybe providing raised crosswalks as a form of traffic calming, partnering with developers on those sorts of things. So hopefully, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, could I just ask, sorry, can I just ask a quick follow-up on that? So with this, the current process right now is if someone in a neighborhood feels like the volume of traffic is just too much, they can come to the city and say, you know, please study my street and see if there's anything that should be done about this. So there is some sort of process if people are concerned about it, but they have to come to you, right?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, in general, residents can come to us about anything. We are a pretty open door city, meaning you can reach out to us and expect a response. And so, yeah, traffic, especially local street complaints about speeding or volume, tend to be one of our top topics, if you will. I get over 400 a year, I would say, on that specific topic, which points out a very real issue. We can't mitigate all of those issues, right? And so what I do, our process, if you're asking for process, is to look at data. So we look at collision data, we look at speed data, and we look at volume data. And so if I were to see, gee, there were not any collisions here for the last 10 years, and this development went in, and now there's 3 in a year. Yeah, I would take note of that, and I would potentially follow up with that community for action. There is not a clear or defined process to say that, though, if your volumes have increased by 10%, then you get a speed hump, or that we're really basing it on a lot of it is led by collision and safety data, because we have upwards of 500 collisions a year in our city. We are obviously not mitigating all of them, right? There's hotspots all over that show routine collisions that have injuries, et cetera. And there's not enough resource to address, to really improve each one of those. And so we have to really be guided by our data. But I think there may be some opportunities, certainly, for partnering with developers, or for providing incentive even for developers in terms of providing traffic calming as part of those projects. And maybe I'm hopeful too that as an industry, our transportation professional folks that study these things might come up with some better guidelines for how to apply traffic calming, because they just frankly don't exist today. So hopefully that's helpful. I know it's not a perfect answer, but it's kind of where we're at.
Vice Chair Revachand.
Thank you. Mine was really to thank you. It was a comment as opposed to a discussion. I just wanted to thank you very much. This is really well thought through, absolutely good. I liked, you did, Commissioner Malik, you didn't make the comment, but that slide shows 2024 that you were talking about, but it speaks to the fact that, yes, the problem would be worse. Here is a study that even doesn't show that location. So I wish people had seen this slide when people were going to court, because this would have spoken a lot to what the city of Shoreline was speaking about. But really, I'm really appreciative. Thank you for the very good work. And I'm going to be transparent right off the get-go. I like to walk, so you know where I stand. I'll just put it that way. Okay, so thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Commissioner Lin.
Yeah, I'm similar to Vice Chair. I'm also want to compliment that this is a, you explained it in a way that I'm not that familiar with transportation master plan, but I can understand the how you set the model and how you draw the conclusions. So thank you. And I am happy to hear because this possible shift or the new proposal of changing, like, for example, the rating from D to to E, or the one that's, let's say the 2A versus, no, 1 and then 2A and 2B, the potential failing project that need to be fixed, kind of one of the slides saying the project's down from 6 required to 5. So that quickly calculate that's 17%. And if that amount of but or capital that was originally needing to be applied to road can apply for pedestrian or the community, walkable community spending, then the traffic calming, and I just hear that's great news, and I appreciate that analysis. And just another quick question is, so because you mentioned doing the modeling, you mentioned the edge effect. When we are like boundarying a Seattle side of the street, so is that calculated in? There's some effect that
From our
kind of affected
neighbors. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the answer is kind of. So I would say that the travel demand model that's used to sort of extrapolate and analyze those intersections does take into account the neighboring jurisdictions, as well as all of the sort of regional projects, large regional projects that are happening. So anything that PSRC is sort of tracking and paying attention to, as well as the various level service standards in other jurisdictions, meaning, you know, Seattle allows quite a bit of delay, right? We know that, and yes, that impacts our city. It impacts trip choices, right? If there's a lot of congestion on a particular Seattle arterial on the south side of our city, people might opt to go a different way, right? And so, yes, the travel demand model does take that into account in terms of trip routing. It does. What we did not do, though, we did not, you know, do a level of service analysis for some of the border intersections, for example, that are not ours. You know, examples would be maybe along SR 104 or 145th in some locations. We did not do that analysis because they're not ours to uphold the standard for. But as you probably well know, we have projects certainly on 145th Street that are still partnering with multiple agencies to try to, you know, achieve better outcomes there. So yeah, so the answer is yes, I would say at a high level, we do anticipate those things in the travel demand model.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any other comments or questions, concerns? Commissioner Malik.
Just a couple last things. One, is there a place we can learn more about the, I think you said Evanston School for the mobility hubs? I thought that was really cool. Would really like to read more and learn more about that. Second was the bridge that's going over 185th to the light rail station there. I know that last we left that, which was a while back, over a year ago or so, maybe even more than that, but over a year ago. Gosh, it just seemed like that was going to be quite a choke point. And I'm kind of sensing that there's a purpose behind that, because you're trying to discourage, you know, especially by the light rail, any kind of use or any kind of driving. But there is parking there too. So what, is there a place, first, is that part of this study? I think it is. And second, is that going to be presented as well? Is that part of the presentation next time?
Yeah, so we won't hone in on any specific area necessarily in that level of detail, but I can answer your question, which is to say, so yes, it is you know, incorporated into the travel demand model in our analysis. We are showing, you know, higher delay there, and with, you know, under our current standard, it would fail. we are, basically showing a preference for exempting that 185th area from the 0.9 to allow it to go up to 1.1. And the reason for that is because into the future, again, like you said, we're trying to discourage a lot of the growth that will be happening there from being auto dependent, right? We want more of the people that move into that area, that work in that area, to be on foot or bike or scooter or whatever, bus, transit, any mode of travel that is not a single occupant vehicle. That's what we're trying to encourage. And so keep in mind that, yes, there is a 500 car garage there. That is not going to be a problem to accommodate. Particularly, it's going to be opening here in the next couple of years. You're not going to see huge levels of delay associated with that garage. I mean, it's certainly an uptick in travel from what you see today, no doubt, but not to the point of where you're getting into LOSE 1.1 or higher types of congestion or delay standards. So, by the time the light rail station opens and over the course of the next, let's say 5 to 7 years, you're not going to dip into that E or over 0.9, standard for a while. It's really the thing that drives that is the amazing amount of growth that we're kind of concentrating in that area. It's not really driven as much by the light rail station. So I would say really what that does is, yes, it encourages people to not drive to this station that's already going to be filled up with parking, right? So we're just trying to we're not trying to invite more people to encourage them to drive in that area is the function of allowing a higher level of delay there.
Thank you.
I will, I'll just answer the second question about the shared use mobility study. Yes, we have a link on our city's webpage that I can share with the clerk to share with the commission that has their white paper as well as a presentation. So I'm happy to share that. And when I come back in March, I will be highlighting more about shared use mobility plans and how we can integrate that with the TMP update.
Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'd just like to say that I echo the sentiments of my fellow commissioners that this was a great presentation, and it really in what I consider something quite technical was very you really helped me understand a lot about it. I also am happy to hear that you touched a bit on pedestrians and safety. That's my biggest concern. I see when traffic increases that sometimes people have a little less patience, both the drivers and the pedestrians, the bicyclists, the scooters, and it can cause issues. So that's my concern as traffic increases, that we see an increase in injuries, accidents. But I know that also that I hear that pedestrian safety is huge. And so I'm very appreciative of that. With that, anybody else? Great. Well, thank you again. We all very much appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you again in March with some more great information.
Thank you so much. All right, bye-bye.
Bye, thank you. All right, moving on. We are at unfinished business. Is there any unfinished business tonight? No. New business. No new business. Reports of the committees and commissioners, or any announcements? Nothing there either. Thank you. And what is the agenda for the next meeting, March 3rd? Does somebody have that information? Is there a meeting on March 3rd?
Those guys fell asleep.
Yeah. Oh, there.
I believe that meeting is going to be canceled. Is that correct, Carla?
Yes, I see Andrew's here too. So I think that we didn't have anything for the agenda, so we were going to ask if we could cancel.
All right.
Yes?
I believe that, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. All right, so our next meeting, it sounds like perhaps will be March 17th. If nobody has anything else, I hope everybody has a great evening, and I'll see you guys soon. Thank you. We are adjourned.